The wind had teeth. It found every gap in the timber walls, every crack in the mortar, every weak point in the construction of men who thought they had conquered the Dakota Territory. Outside, the world had turned white and terrible. The temperature had plummeted to 38 degrees below zero. The wind sustained at 70 miles an hour. It was not weather. It was an apocalypse. Inside the Earth Lodge there was only warmth. Prudence Caldwell sat on a low wooden stool, stirring a pot of rabbit stew over a small cast-iron stove. The glow from the fire reflected off the stone walls around her walls she had built with her own hands. The temperature in this underground sanctuary held steady at 60 degrees. Not hot, not cold, just enough, just life. She was 19 years old. She heard them before they reached the door. The desperate scrabbling in the snow above. The muffled shouts of men who had run out of options and were now running out of time. She did not move. She simply waited, the wooden spoon turning slowly in the pot, the steam rising in gentle spirals. Then came the pounding, fists against wood, frantic, dying. She rose, calmly walked to the heavy insulated door, lifted the bar, and pulled it open. A wave of warmth rolled out into the tunnel they had dug through 10 feet of snow. 6 men fell through the opening like corpses tumbling into a grave. But this grave was warm. This grave was salvation. They collapsed onto the packed earth floor, their faces encrusted with ice, their hands clawed and useless, their eyes wide with the shock of men who had just touched the edge of death and been pulled back. Prudence looked down at them. She recognized every face. The mayor, the mill owner, the reverend, the men who had called her a fool, the men who had laughed. Her expression did not change. No triumph, no bitterness, just a calm, settled certainty. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of inevitability. I have been expecting you. Take off your coats before you catch a chill. There is soup. The mayor, Thaddeus Brennan, stared up at her. Ice crystals fell from his frozen beard. His lips tried to form words, but only a rasping breath emerged. Prudence turned back to her pot, and the door swung closed behind them, sealing out the howling universe of white death. The storm had been coming for 6 months. She had seen it in the way the sandhill cranes flew south 3 weeks early, their formations ragged and urgent against a September sky that should have still been summer warm, but already carried the metallic taste of winter. She had seen it in the beaver dams on Willow Creek, built higher and thicker than any year she could remember. The animals working with a desperate intensity that spoke of knowledge coded into their bones, but she had known it most clearly when she dug the first test hole on her land in late September. The frost line was already 6 inches deep. In late September, she had stood there holding the cold earth in her bare hand and heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if the old woman were standing beside her. When the earth speaks, child, you listen. Not with your ears, with your whole life. Her grandmother had been dead for 2 years, but her journals remained. 40 years of careful observations, drawings, calculations, Survival knowledge passed down from generations who had lived on this land long before it was called the Dakota Territory. Long before men like Thaddeus Brennan had arrived with their timber and their certainty. Prudence had learned to read before she learned to read books. She learned to read the land, the angle of light on frost, the behavior of animals, the patterns in the wind. These were not superstitions. They were data. They were science older than science had a name. And every piece of data, every sign, every indication pointed to the same conclusion. The winter of 1876 would not be harsh. It would be annihilating. 6 months earlier, she had been someone else entirely. Or rather, she had been learning to become who she was now. May 1876. The apple trees had been in bloom, their white petals drifting across the small plot of land she and Silas had called home. He had been 24, strong, kind. A logger who understood wood the way some men understood horses or cards. He could look at a tree and know its story, its age, its value. On the morning of May 14th, he had kissed her forehead, told her he would be home before dark, and walked into the forest to work at Gideon Mitchell's lumber operation. He never walked out. The widow of the foreman came to her door at sunset. The woman could not meet Prudence's eyes. The words came out flat and rehearsed. There was an accident. A cable snapped. Silas was caught in the fall. He died instantly. Mr. Mitchell sends his condolences and a month's wages. The woman handed over an envelope. $14. The price of a husband. The price of a future. Prudence had stood in the doorway holding the envelope, feeling the world tilt and reshape itself into something colder and stranger. She did not cry. Not then. She simply nodded, thanked the woman, and closed the door. Later, when she opened the envelope, she found not just money, but a note in Mitchell's own hand. These things happen. The work is dangerous. No negligence occurred. 4 sentences. No signature. She folded the note carefully and placed it in her grandmother's trunk, alongside the journals and the pressed flowers and the small leather pouch of earth from the old woman's grave. That night she had cried. Not for long. Not loudly. Just enough to mark the ending of one life and the beginning of another. She was 19 years old and alone. The town of Ashford Ridge had not known what to do with her. A widow so young was a kind of living ghost, a reminder of mortality in a place that prided itself on conquest and endurance. The women offered casseroles and pity in equal measure. The men offered nothing at all except for sidelong glances that made her skin crawl. She took the casseroles. She endured the pity. She ignored the glances, and she went to work. Her grandmother had taught her to sew when she was 6 years old. Not decorative stitching, practical work, mending, altering, the kind of skill that kept clothes functional through hard winters. Prudence set up a small sign outside her door. Mending and alterations, fair prices. The work came slowly at first, then steadily. She was fast. She was good. She charged less than the seamstress in town, a pinched woman named Hortense Crow. who treated every garment like a personal insult. By September, Prudence had saved $47. It was not enough to leave. Not enough to start over somewhere else. But it was enough for something. She just did not know what yet. Then came the signs. September turned cold fast. Not the gradual cooling of autumn, but a sudden hard shift, as if a door had been slammed shut somewhere in the heavens. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned yellow and fell in a single week. The grass browned. The air took on a brittle quality that made sounds carry too far and too sharp. Prudence noticed. She always noticed. But it was the cranes that crystallized her understanding into something urgent and undeniable. She had been walking along the ridge on a Sunday morning, the one day she allowed herself to rest from sewing, when she saw them. Hundreds of sandhill cranes, their enormous wings beating in perfect synchrony, their calls echoing across the valley like rusty hinges on the doors of heaven. They should not have been migrating yet, not for another 3 weeks. She stood on the ridge and watched them disappear into the southern sky, and a cold certainty settled into her bones. The next day she walked to Willow Creek. The beaver dams had always been impressive. The animals were engineers of remarkable skill, building structures that could withstand spring floods and summer droughts. But what Prudence saw that morning went beyond impressive. It was frantic. The main dam had been raised another 4 feet since she had last checked it in August. Fresh mud and branches were plastered across the top, and she could see 3 beavers working even now, their movements quick and purposeful. The secondary dam, usually abandoned this time of year, had been completely rebuilt. The animals were preparing for something catastrophic. She knew. She walked back to her small cabin and retrieved the shovel from the lean-to. She chose a spot on the south-facing slope of her land, a place where the sun would hit hardest even in deep winter, and began to dig. 6 inches down, the soil was already frozen. In late September, she had lived in Dakota Territory her entire 19 years. She had seen hard winters. The winter of '68, when snow fell for 11 straight days. The winter of '72, when the river froze so solid that wagons crossed it without cracking the ice. But she had never seen frost this early, this deep. She stood up, brushed the frozen soil from her hands, and looked across the valley toward Ashford Ridge. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. The town looked peaceful, confident, utterly unprepared. That night she opened her grandmother's trunk. The journals were there, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. 5 leather-bound books filled with meticulous handwriting in faded brown ink. Observations, drawings, calculations, designs. Her grandmother had been born in 1791. She had lived through 83 winters before dying peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1874. She had been called many things: healer, midwife, wise woman, witch. She had never called herself anything but Elizabeth. Elizabeth Whitmore, born to a settler family but raised for 7 years by Lakota women, after her parents died of fever. She had learned their ways, their language, their understanding of the land. Then she had returned to the white world, married a blacksmith named Whitmore, raised 6 children, and quietly preserved knowledge that most people thought was primitive superstition. Prudence had been her youngest granddaughter and her most devoted student. The old woman had died holding Prudence's hand, her voice reduced to a whisper. "The earth remembers, child. We just have to listen." Now, sitting alone in her cabin with the journals spread across the table, Prudence listened. She turned to the entry dated February 1843. The winter came early and stayed late. The first snow fell on October 12th. The last snow fell on April 30th. Nearly 7 months. The temperature dropped below zero and did not rise above it for 43 consecutive days. Those who relied solely on wood fires in timber cabins suffered greatly. Many died. The Morrison family survived only because they moved into their root cellar, which held the earth's warmth. 16 feet below ground, the temperature never fell below 45 degrees. The earth does not freeze all the way down. 6 feet below the frost line there is warmth. Always. Prudence read the entry 3 times. Then she turned to the diagrams. Her grandmother had drawn them with remarkable precision. Cross-sections of earth-sheltered dwellings, calculations of thermal mass, designs for ventilation systems that would bring in fresh air without losing heat, instructions for building glazed roofs that would capture sunlight and turn it into warmth that stone walls could absorb and radiate back through the long, cold nights. It was all there, everything she needed to know. She closed the journal and sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the wind beginning to rise outside. The decision formed, slowly solidifying like ice. She would warn them. She would give them the chance to prepare properly, to build what needed to be built. And if they refused to listen, she would build it herself. The town council met on the last Saturday of every month in the assembly hall, a timber structure that served as courthouse, church, and community center, depending on the day and the need. On October 29, 1876, nearly every able-bodied adult in Ashford Ridge crowded into its confines. The air smelled of wet wool and tobacco, and the particular masculine confidence of men who believed they had tamed a wilderness. Prudence sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, her dark dress making her nearly invisible against the rough wooden wall. She had debated whether to come at all. She was not a landowner in the traditional sense. Her 3 acres had been Silas's inherited from his father, and now they were hers, by virtue of widowhood, not ownership. She had no vote, no voice, not officially. But she came anyway. Mayor Thaddeus Brennan stood at the front of the hall, his considerable bulk barely contained by a waistcoat that had fit him better 5 years and 30 pounds ago. He was 58 years old, with thick gray sideburns and the kind of resonant voice that made people assume authority even when no wisdom backed it up. He cleared his throat and the murmur of conversation died. "Gentlemen and ladies," he nodded toward the handful of women present, including Prudence, though his eyes slid past her without recognition. "We are here to discuss preparations for the coming winter. As many of you know, the Farmer's Almanac predicts a colder than average season. I have consulted with our most experienced citizens and we have developed a comprehensive plan. He gestured to a tall, lean man standing off to the side. Gideon Mitchell, owner of the lumber mill. A man whose wealth was carved from the forest one tree at a time. Mitchell stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. The Mitchell operation will double its cordwood production through November, he announced. Every family in Ashford Ridge will receive a full allotment, 2 cords per household, 3 for families with more than 4 children. This will be sufficient for even the harshest winter on record. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Brennan smiled. Additionally, we will be distributing extra wool blankets from the general store's inventory at cost. We encourage everyone to ensure their homes are properly chinked, and that all gaps in walls and around windows are sealed with rags or newspaper. We have faced hard winters before. We will face this one with the same fortitude that built this town. More nods, more murmurs of agreement. Then Reverend Josiah Walsh stood. He was a narrow man with narrow convictions, 52 years old, and every one of them spent in the certainty that God favored those who prayed loudly and judged quietly. Brothers and sisters, he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a Sunday sermon. Let us not forget that our preparations are important, but our faith is paramount. The Lord provides for those who trust in His providence. I propose we also hold a special service of thanksgiving and supplication before the first snowfall. We will ask for His protection and give thanks for His bounty. Hear, hear, someone called out. Brennan nodded approvingly. An excellent suggestion, Reverend. We will set a date. The meeting was drawing to a close. The plan was set. Cordwood, blankets, chinking, prayer. It was not enough. Prudence stood. The scrape of her chair against the floorboards was unnaturally loud in the settling quiet. Every head turned. She walked forward slowly, her boots making soft sounds against the wood. She could feel the weight of their stares, the confusion, the mild irritation at this interruption by someone who should know better. She reached the front of the hall and turned to face them. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. It will not be enough. Silence. Thaddeus Brennan's expression shifted from surprise to something closer to paternal concern. He tilted his head slightly the way one might regard a child who had said something amusing but inappropriate. Pardon me, Miss Caldwell. She noted the Miss instead of Mrs. A widow reverted to maiden status in the eyes of men like Brennan. Your plan, she continued, cordwood and blankets. It will not be enough for the winter that is coming. Brennan's smile tightened. I appreciate your concern, Miss Caldwell, but I assure you we have consulted extensively. The Cranes migrated 3 weeks early. Prudence interrupted. Her voice remained calm, but it cut through his like a blade through cloth. The beaver dams on Willow Creek have been reinforced to twice their normal height. The frost line in late September was already 6 inches deep. These are not normal conditions. These are warnings. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from the crowd. Someone in the back muttered something she could not quite hear, but the tone was dismissive. Gideon Mitchell stepped forward, his expression less patient than Brennan's. "Miss Caldwell, I mean no disrespect, but beaver dams and bird migrations are hardly scientific indicators of—" "They are precisely scientific indicators," Prudence said. "Animals respond to environmental pressures we have not yet measured. They are data. My grandmother kept records for over 40 years. The winter of 1843 showed identical patterns. That winter lasted 7 months, 43 consecutive days below zero. People died." The laughter stopped. Brennan held up a hand, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Miss Caldwell, your grandmother was a knowledgeable woman in her own way. But surely you understand that we cannot base the town's preparations on what?" Prudence asked quietly. "On observation, on records, on evidence." "On old wives' tales," Mitchell finished bluntly. The words hung in the air like a slap. Prudence did not flinch. She had expected this. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully. "This is a calculation of thermal efficiency," she said, holding it up. "A standard timber cabin loses heat at a rate that makes it uninhabitable when outside temperatures drop below -20 and wind speeds exceed 40 miles per hour. Even with continuous fires, the interior temperature will drop below freezing within 12 hours. Your cordwood will not matter. Your blankets will not matter. The structures themselves are thermally inadequate." She paused, looking around the room. "What you need is not more wood. What you need is earth." Dead silence now. No laughter. Just stunned incomprehension. Reverend Walsh found his voice first. "Earth. An earth-sheltered dwelling," Prudence explained. "A structure built into the south-facing slope of a hill. The walls are made of rammed earth and stone. The roof is partially buried and partially glazed to capture sunlight. 6 feet below the frost line, the ground maintains a constant temperature of approximately 45 to 50 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. This is geothermal stability. This is thermal mass. This is how you survive a winter when the air itself becomes deadly." The words landed like stones into still water. Brennan stared at her as if she had suddenly begun speaking in tongues. "You are proposing," he said slowly, "that we abandon our homes and burrow into the ground like animals. I am proposing that you build a communal shelter that uses the earth's own heat to keep you alive when wood fires cannot." Mitchell's face had gone red. "This is absurd. We have lived in timber homes for 40 years. My father helped build this town. His lumber will burn," Prudence said simply. "It will burn hot and fast, and it will not be enough. The earth does not burn. The earth holds warmth." Walsh stepped forward. His narrow face twisted with something between pity and contempt. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice dripping with false gentleness, "I understand that you have suffered a great loss. Your husband, your grandmother. Grief can make us susceptible to irrational fears. But what you are describing is not Christian. It is not civilized. The Lord gave man dominion over the earth, not to hide within it like pagans. The word pagan was not quite shouted, but it carried the weight of accusation. Prudence looked at him steadily. "My grandmother helped deliver half the children in this room," she said quietly, "including yours, Reverend. All 4 of them. All alive. All healthy. She used knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that your medicine and your prayers could not match. You called her wise then. You call it pagan now because I am young and female and you do not want to hear what I am saying." Walsh's face went white, then red. Brennan raised both hands, trying to restore order. "Miss Caldwell, I think, Prudence said, her voice still quiet but somehow filling the entire hall, "that you will not listen. You will continue with your plan. You will stack your cordwood. You will pray. And when the storm comes, and it will come, you will burn everything you have, and it will not be enough." She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. "I came here to warn you. I came here to offer a solution. You have rejected both. That is your choice." She turned to leave, but Brennan's voice stopped her. "And what will you do, Miss Caldwell?" She turned back, looked him in the eye. "I will build my own shelter, and I will survive." The silence that followed was absolute. Then someone in the back laughed. A single bark of disbelief that broke the tension like a stone through glass. Others joined in. Not cruel laughter, not exactly, but the kind of nervous, uncomfortable laughter that comes when people do not know how else to respond to something too strange to process. "The Cave Girl," someone muttered. The nickname was born in that moment. Prudence heard it. She saw Brennan's expression shift from anger to something closer to pity. She saw Mitchell shake his head. She saw Walsh's lips moving in what might have been a prayer, or might have been a curse. She had given them the chance. They had chosen. She walked out of the assembly hall into the cold October night. The first snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall, tiny crystals that melted on her cheeks like cold tears. Behind her, the meeting resumed. Voices rose in reassurance. Cordwood, blankets, prayer. The familiar rituals of survival. The ways that had always worked, until they did not. Prudence walked the 2 miles back to her small cabin in the darkness. The snow fell harder now, beginning to stick to the frozen ground. By the time she reached her door, a thin white layer covered everything. She went inside, lit the lamp, and sat at her grandmother's table. She pulled out the journals again, studied the diagrams, made calculations by the flickering light. She had $47. She had 6 weeks, maybe 7, before the real cold set in. She had 3 acres of land with a perfect south-facing slope. She had knowledge that no one else believed. She had no choice. The next morning, November 1st, 1876, Prudence Caldwell began to dig. The general store smelled of coffee and kerosene, and the particular mustiness of goods that had traveled too far to reach a place too small to matter much. Prudence stood at the counter, her $47 counted out in front of her. in neat stacks of coins. The proprietor, a man named Wendell Hicks, regarded her with the expression of someone watching a child about to make a very stupid purchase. "You are certain about this, Miss Caldwell?" She did not look up from the tools she had selected. A spade with a reinforced ash handle. A pickaxe with a head that still held a decent edge. 100 feet of strong twine. 24 wooden stakes. A small canvas sack of 10-penny nails. "I am certain." Hicks picked up the pickaxe, testing its weight. "This is a man's tool. Heavy work." "Yes." "And you are planning to dig?" He set the pickaxe down carefully. "Miss Caldwell, I heard what happened at the town meeting. I understand you have concerns about the winter. But this seems $27, Prudence said, her voice flat. "That is the total. I have 47. I would like the change in smaller denominations if possible." Hicks studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there convinced him that further conversation would be pointless. He wrapped the tools in burlap, tied them with cord, and counted out her change with meticulous care. $20, mostly in silver coins, smaller denominations as requested. She gathered the tools and the money, nodded once, and walked out. Behind her, she heard Hicks mutter something to another customer. The words, "cave girl," carried clearly through the morning air. She did not look back. The land she owned was not much. 3 acres on the eastern edge of Ashford Ridge, where the valley began its gradual climb toward the timberline. Silas had inherited it from his father, who had claimed it in the first wave of settlement back when land was measured in sweat and hope, rather than dollars and deeds. It had always been considered inferior property. The slope was too steep for good farming. The soil was thin and rocky. There was no creek, no natural water source beyond what could be collected from rain or hauled from the town well. But it had one feature that no one else had valued: a south-facing slope. Prudence stood at the base of her land and looked up. The morning sun struck the hillside at an angle that would remain consistent through the winter months. Even when the sun's arc shortened and weakened, this slope would catch every available degree of warmth. She walked slowly up the incline, her boots crunching through the thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight. 2/3 of the way up, she stopped. This was the place, high enough to be above any potential water table, sheltered from the northern winds by the crest of the ridge, positioned to maximize southern exposure. She set down her tools and began to mark out the dimensions: 24 feet east to west, 14 feet north to south. She drove the stakes into the frozen ground with a rock, then strung the twine between them, creating a precise rectangle. She walked the perimeter 3 times, checking angles, adjusting stakes, making certain. When she was satisfied, she picked up the pickaxe. The first swing was a revelation, not because it was easy, because it was hard in ways she had not anticipated. The frozen topsoil resisted the blade like iron. The impact jolted up her arms, through her shoulders into her spine. Her hands, unused to this kind of sustained violence, screamed in protest. She swung again and again. By the time the sun reached its apex, she had cleared the topsoil from perhaps 1/10 of the marked rectangle. Her hands were raw. Her back was a single continuous ache. Her breath came in ragged gasps that misted in the cold air. She sat down on a flat rock, ate a piece of hard bread and dried venison, and looked at what she had accomplished. It was not much. It was nowhere near enough. But it was a beginning. She picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. The days developed a rhythm that was both brutal and meditative. Wake before dawn. Eat quickly. Walk to the site. Dig until the light failed. Walk home. Eat again. Sleep. Repeat. The pickaxe broke the earth. The spade lifted and moved it. The wheelbarrow she had built from salvaged wood and an old wagon wheel transported the excavated soil downhill to a designated dump site. Every swing of the pickaxe was a choice. Every shovelful was a commitment. The townspeople noticed. Of course they noticed. Ashford Ridge was small enough that any deviation from routine became immediate entertainment. A young widow digging a hole in the side of a hill was not just unusual, it was theater. They rode past on the main road which skirted the edge of her property. They slowed their horses. They pointed. They laughed. Digging your own grave, cave girl. Looking for gold, there is none up there. Should have married again instead of playing in the dirt. She heard them. She did not respond. She simply kept working. By the end of the first week, the hole was 4 feet deep across the entire marked area. She had moved, by her own calculation, approximately 1,300 cubic feet of earth, one shovelful at a time. Her body was changing. The soft places hardened. Her shoulders broadened. The muscles in her arms and back developed the kind of lean, functional strength that comes not from occasional labor but from relentless daily punishment. The blisters on her palms burst, bled and calloused over into thick protective pads. She was becoming something else, something harder. Something that could not be broken by mockery or exhaustion or doubt. By the end of the second week, the pit was 8 feet deep. She stopped digging downward and began to shape. The walls needed to be perfect. Not smooth roughness would help the earth bond with itself, but vertical and true. She used a plumb line made from a stone tied to string, checking, constantly tamping the walls with the flat of her spade until they were as hard as fired clay. The north wall, which would face the worst of the winter winds, needed special attention. She walked to the dry creek bed at the bottom of her property where centuries of spring runoff had deposited fieldstones of every size and shape. She selected carefully. Flat stones. Stones that would stack and interlock. Stones heavy enough to provide thermal mass, but small enough that she could carry them alone. She hauled them up the hill one by one. It took 3 days to gather enough stone for what she had planned. Then she began to build. The technique came from her grandmother's journals. A double wall. The outer wall was the earth itself, tamped and solid. The inner wall was stone set with a mortar made from clay mixed with water, and a small amount of lime she had purchased from Hicks. Each stone was placed with care. Each gap was filled. The wall grew slowly, a course at a time, extending the thickness of the north barrier by 2 full feet. This was not decoration. This was armor. A thermal battery that would absorb any warmth that entered the space and refuse to surrender it to the cold outside. On the afternoon of November 19th, she became aware of someone watching her. She did not stop working. She simply noted the presence of a man on horseback stationary on the road below and continued mortaring the next stone into place. After several minutes, the man dismounted and began walking up the slope. She straightened, wiping clay from her hands onto her work apron. She recognized him as he approached. Amos Whitlock, 68 years old, the town's most experienced carpenter, a man whose joints were too stiff for heavy work anymore, but whose knowledge was still sharp. He stopped at the edge of the pit and looked down at her handiwork. His face revealed nothing. Miss Caldwell. Mr. Whitlock. He walked slowly around the perimeter, examining the walls, the stone construction, the dimensions. He picked up one of her grandmother's journals, which she had left open to a page of diagrams, and studied it carefully. Finally, he spoke. Your grandmother taught my wife midwifery. Prudence said nothing. She knew this already. 4 children born alive, he continued. All healthy, no fever, no complications. Sarah credited your grandmother entirely. He paused. She passed 3 years ago. Sarah. The fever took her in 2 days. Nothing anyone could do. I am sorry. Whitlock nodded. She always said your grandmother knew things, real things, not superstition, knowledge. He tapped the journal. This is sound design. Something in Prudence's chest loosened slightly. You think it will work? Whitlock looked at the stone wall, then back at the diagrams. The winter of 1843, my father lost his cabin. Fire. They were burning so much wood trying to stay warm that sparks caught the roof. Burned to the foundation in an hour. He moved the family into the root cellar for the rest of the winter. 8 people in a space barely bigger than this. Cold, but they lived. He always said the earth saved them when the cabin couldn't. He handed the journal back to her. Your roof pitch needs to be steeper. 45 degrees minimum. Snow will build up otherwise, and the weight will collapse your glazing. Prudence felt something like gratitude, sharp and uncomfortable. Thank you. I cannot help, Whitlock said bluntly. My back would not survive a day of this work. And if I were seen helping you, there would be consequences. For both of us. The town has made its decision about you. I understand. But I can tell you this. He pointed to the southern edge of the pit. Your front posts need to be at least 10 feet tall. Your back posts no more than 3. That will give you the pitch you need. Use the thickest timbers you can find for the ridge pole. It has to bear the weight of earth and snow. And for God's sake, make sure your ventilation exits above the snow line, or you will suffocate in your own air. He met her eyes. You are doing something remarkable here, Miss Caldwell. Foolish, perhaps, but remarkable. He turned and walked back down the slope to his horse. Prudence stood in the pit holding her grandmother's journal. and felt the weight of the old carpenter's words settle into her bones like warmth. She was not entirely alone. The roof was the most dangerous part of the construction. Timber was not the problem. The forest began less than a quarter-mile from her land, and while she could not afford to purchase lumber from Mitchell's mill, she could harvest young pines from the edge of her property. They were not ideal. Green wood was heavy and would shrink as it dried, but they would serve. The real challenge was the glazing. She needed glass, large panes of it, positioned at a steep southern-facing angle to capture the low winter sun and transform it into heat that the stone walls could absorb and hold. New glass was out of the question. The cost would consume her remaining $20 and still not be enough, which meant she needed to salvage. The Miller homestead was 5 miles east, accessible by a narrow trail that had once been a road, but was now mostly overgrown. The place had burned 2 years earlier. The family, a couple and their 3 children, had been inside when it happened. No one knew exactly what started the fire. A spark from the chimney. An overturned lamp. The result was the same. The site was considered haunted now. A place to be avoided. Prudence saddled the mule she had inherited from Silas and loaded the small travois she had built from pine branches and rope. She set out at dawn on November 26th, knowing she had perhaps 3 weeks before the real cold arrived. The trail was harder to follow than she remembered. Snow had fallen and melted and fallen again, obscuring the path. Twice she had to dismount and lead the mule through thick brush. But she knew the general direction, and by midday she saw the blackened timbers rising from the snow like broken teeth. The destruction was total. The main house was gone, reduced to a rectangle of charred wood and collapsed stone. The barn had survived better, but its roof had fallen in, making it useless. But the windows. The Millers had been proud of their windows. Large sashes imported from the East glass that was almost perfectly clear. The fire had blown them out early before the heat could crack the panes, and several had landed in the weeds beyond the main structure. Prudence worked carefully, digging through snow and debris. She found 6 sashes each, measuring approximately 3 feet by 5 feet. The glass was intact. Miraculous. She loaded them onto the travois with painstaking care, cushioning each one with pine boughs to prevent cracking. The mule snorted and shifted nervously, as if the place made it uncomfortable. Prudence understood the feeling. As she worked, she noticed something half buried in the snow near what had been the kitchen. A small leather journal, its cover warped and stained but still intact. She picked it up, brushed off the snow, and opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was neat and feminine. A diary. Mrs. Miller's. Most of the entries were mundane. Weather notes, recipes, complaints about the difficulty of keeping the house warm in winter. But one entry dated January 1856 stopped her cold. The cabin is too cold. We burned through our entire wood supply by mid-February and still the children shiver. Robert says we must endure, but I am afraid. I remember the winter I was a child when our family survived in the root cellar. 10 feet below ground, we were warm when the cabin above froze solid. I wish we had such a place now. But Robert will not hear of it. He says it is uncivilized. He says we must trust in providence and in timber. I pray he is right. The final entry was dated March 2nd, 1874, 2 weeks before the fire. The chimney bricks are cracking. I can see daylight through the gaps. Robert says he will repair it in the spring, but we cannot afford the proper mortar now. He bought the cheaper mixture from Mitchell's mill. I am uneasy. Prudence closed the journal. The Millers had died because they trusted in timber, because they could not afford proper materials, because pride or poverty or both had kept them from seeking a better way. She placed the journal carefully in her pack. It would go in her grandmother's trunk alongside the other evidence, the other warnings. The journey back took the rest of the day. The travois was heavy, and the mule moved slowly. But by sunset, she had the 6 window sashes safely stacked near her construction site. She had glazing. Now she needed a frame to hold it. The next week was the hardest. She felled 6 young pines for the main structural timbers, working with a bucksaw that left her arms trembling and her hands bleeding again through the calluses. She stripped the branches and dragged the logs to her site. The physics of raising the roof frame alone seemed impossible. 4 posts, 2 at the front 10 feet tall, 2 at the back 3 feet tall, a ridge pole connecting them at the top, rafters spanning from ridge to eaves. Every beam had to be lifted into position. Every connection had to be secured with nails driven through pre-drilled holes. She had no help, no second pair of hands, no one to hold a post steady while she secured it. She used ropes and leverage. She dug holes for the front posts, stood them upright, then used the ropes tied to stakes driven into the ground to keep them vertical while she backfilled and tamped. She repeated the process for the back posts. The ridge pole was the worst. It was a single log nearly 25 feet long and heavy enough that she could barely shift it alone. Getting it into position 12 feet above the ground required a system of ropes and pulleys rigged from the posts themselves. Twice the rope slipped. Twice the log crashed down, missing her by inches. The third time she succeeded. The ridge pole settled into the notches she had cut in the tops of the posts, and she nailed it secure with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. She sat down in the pit and allowed herself 5 minutes to simply breathe. Then she got up and started on the rafters. On the afternoon of December 3rd, Gideon Mitchell rode past her property. He reined in his horse and sat watching her work for several minutes. She was fitting the salvaged window sashes into the southern slope of the roof, sealing the gaps with a mixture of pine pitch and strips of cloth. Finally, he called out, "Still time to quit this foolishness, girl." Prudence did not look up from her work. "I am not quitting. I am finishing." Mitchell's expression shifted to something harder. "Your husband died working for me. I paid his widow's portion. We are square, Miss Caldwell. You have no claim on my time or my charity. I have made no claim. Then what do you call this performance, this public display of stubbornness?" She set down her sealing tool and finally looked at him. "I call it survival, Mr. Mitchell. I call it using my hands and my mind to build something that will keep me alive when your lumber cannot. I call it listening to evidence instead of pride. Mitchell's face darkened. My lumber built this town. Your lumber will burn, Prudence said quietly. It will burn hot and fast, and it will not be enough. You know this. You are a businessman. You understand thermodynamics even if you do not call it by that name. You know that wood is fuel, not insulation. You know that glass and stone and earth are different, better. For a moment, something flickered across Mitchell's face. Not quite doubt, but not quite certainty either. Then it hardened again. I know that I have made my fortune on lumber. I know that timber has served this town for 40 years. I know that desperate women sometimes grasp at desperate solutions and call it wisdom. He turned his horse. When you freeze to death in that hole, Miss Caldwell, do not expect the town to mourn. You made your choice. Live with it, or die with it. He rode away. Prudence watched him go, then returned to her ceiling work. The roof was nearly complete now. The northern half was covered with heavy planks, salvaged from the miller's site, then layered with oiled canvas for waterproofing, then buried under 3 feet of earth. That would serve as both insulation and camouflage. From the north, the structure was almost invisible, just another fold in the hillside. The southern half was the wall of salvaged windows, 6 panes of glass, set at a 45-degree angle, sealed against wind and water, ready to capture every photon of weak winter sunlight and transform it into warmth. The final engineering challenge was ventilation. Her grandmother's journals were explicit on this point. A sealed underground space would quickly become uninhabitable. Moisture from breathing and cooking would condense on the walls. The air would grow stale and dangerous. She needed 2 vents, fresh air in, stale air out. The intake was simple enough. She buried a 6-inch diameter stovepipe at a shallow angle from the base of the south-facing windows, running it 30 feet up the hill before allowing it to emerge above ground. Air drawn through this pipe would be pre-warmed by contact with the earth before entering the living space. The exhaust was trickier. It had to exit from the highest point of the interior where warm, stale air would naturally accumulate. It had to rise high enough to stay clear of snow. It had to create enough draft to pull air through without losing too much heat. She installed a vertical pipe through the earth-covered northern roof section, extending it 6 feet above the projected snowline. She fitted a simple cap to prevent downdrafts and snow infiltration. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Warm air rose, cold air fell. The earth provided a buffer. Physics did the rest. By December 8th, the structure was functionally complete. The interior was Spartan but carefully planned. A sleeping bunk built into the western earth wall, just a simple wooden frame with a platform for a straw mattress. Along the stone-reinforced north wall, she constructed a long, low bench from fieldstones and clay mortar. The bench was hollow. Inside it, she installed the small cast-iron stove she had traded for 3 months of mending work, exchanged with a widow whose husband had died the previous spring. But instead of running the stovepipe directly through the roof, Prudence ran it horizontally through the length of the stone bench before allowing it to turn vertical and exit through the ceiling. This meant that almost every calorie of heat generated by the fire would be absorbed by the stone mass of the bench before the smoke escaped. The bench would become a slow-release radiator holding warmth for hours after the fire died. She would need to burn only a fraction of the wood a conventional cabin required. On the morning of December 10th, she stood outside her creation and performed a final inspection. Total cost $31. Tools, materials, stovepipe nails. Total time 6 weeks of relentless labor. Total help none. One conversation with an old carpenter who could not risk being seen assisting her. She walked the perimeter one last time, checking seals, testing the ventilation draw, examining the roof for any potential weak points. It was not beautiful. The glass was salvaged and imperfect. The timbers were rough. The earth-covered northern slope looked like an accidental hill, but it was sound. She began moving her possessions from the cabin, her grandmother's trunk, her small collection of books, the sacks of preserved vegetables and dried meat she had prepared through the summer and autumn, her minimal wardrobe, the stack of firewood she had carefully rationed. It was not much. The accumulated possessions of a 19-year-old widow who had never owned much to begin with. It fit easily. On the evening of December 10th, as the sun set in a sky that was taking on that peculiar yellowish tint that precedes deep cold, Prudence stood in the doorway of her earth lodge and looked back toward Ashford Ridge. Smoke rose from every chimney in town. The buildings looked small and vulnerable against the vast backdrop of the valley. Lights appeared in windows as lamps were lit against the gathering dark. They were confident. They had their cordwood stacked high. They had their blankets. They had their prayers. She turned and went inside. The temperature within the earth lodge with no fire burning held at 52 degrees. Outside, the thermometer she had hung on a post near the entrance read 18 degrees and falling. She lit a small fire in the stove. Within an hour, the stone bench began to radiate a gentle, penetrating warmth. The interior temperature climbed to 60 degrees and stabilized there. She ate a simple meal. Stew made from dried venison and preserved vegetables. Bread she had baked 3 days earlier. She sat on the stone bench, feeling its warmth seep into her back and shoulders. She opened one of her grandmother's journals and read by lamplight. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise. On December 12th, the sky turned the color of old brass. Prudence stood outside her earth lodge, watching the light change. The clouds were moving in from the north, but they were not the gray woolliness of normal snow clouds. These were darker, bruised, moving with an urgency that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The wind had a sound to it now, not the normal whistle through trees, something deeper, a bass note that came from far away and promised violence. She checked her supplies one last time. Food, water in sealed containers, firewood carefully stacked, the door seal reinforced with extra cloth and pitch. Everything was ready. On the evening of December 15th, 3 days earlier than she had calculated, the first real cold arrived. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. Prudence sealed herself inside the earth lodge, secured the bar across the door, and waited. The storm was coming. The storm did not arrive gradually. It arrived like a fist. December 18th, 1876. The morning began with that brass-colored sky, a sickly yellow light that made everything look jaundiced and wrong. The wind had been building through the night, but at dawn it suddenly fell silent, completely silent. The absence of sound was worse than the noise had been. In Ashford Ridge, people looked at each other across kitchen tables and felt the pressure change in their bones. Something was coming. Something they had no name for. Then, from the north it appeared. Not a cloud bank. A wall. A solid, churning mass of darkness that seemed to devour the horizon as it advanced. It was not weather. It was erasure. Inside her earth lodge, Prudence watched through the angled glass as the wall approached. She had lit a small fire in the stove hours earlier, and the interior temperature held steady at 58 degrees. The stone bench radiated warmth against her back. She had food. She had water. She had warmth and air and time. She settled onto the bench and opened one of her grandmother's journals to a section she had read a dozen times before. When the white death comes, it comes with no mercy. Those who stand against it will fall. Those who shelter within the earth will endure. This is not cowardice. This is wisdom older than pride. The wall hit. The world outside transformed in an instant from brass-lit winter to absolute chaos. The wind did not build. It simply existed fully formed at sustained speeds that made the earth lodge shudder. Despite being mostly buried, Prudence felt the percussion of it through the ground itself. The glass panels rattled in their frames but held. The seals she had so carefully applied did their work. The wind found no purchase, no gap, no weakness to exploit. Snow came horizontally, not falling but flying ice crystals moving at velocities that would strip flesh from bone. The temperature, which had been 18 degrees at dawn, plummeted. 20 degrees in the first hour. 30 degrees by midday. By nightfall, the thermometer outside before the wind tore it from its mounting red, 38 degrees below zero. But the wind was the true killer. At 70 miles per hour, sustained with gusts reaching higher, the wind chill created temperatures that were beyond the capacity of human flesh to endure. Exposed skin would freeze in under 2 minutes. A man caught outside would be dead in 5. Inside the earth lodge, Prudence experienced the apocalypse as a distant, muffled roar, like standing inside a drum while someone beat it, but gently from far away. The temperature inside dropped to 48 degrees. She added 3 small logs to the stove. Within 30 minutes, the stone bench absorbed the heat and radiated it back. The temperature climbed to 60 degrees and held there. The snow began to pile against the southern glass face, but the steep 45-degree angle Amos Whitlock had recommended caused most of it to slide off and accumulate at the base. What did build up on the earth-covered northern roof was not a problem. It was additional insulation, a gift from the storm itself. Prudence ate a meal of stewed rabbit and dried vegetables heated on the stove. She drank water from her sealed containers. She read by lamplight while the world outside tried to kill everything that breathed. The sound of the storm was almost restful, a constant white noise that drowned out thought and invited sleep. She was the eye of the hurricane, a small warm pocket of life in a universe of frozen death. In Ashford Ridge, it was hell. The wind found every weakness in construction that 40 years of building experience had failed to anticipate. It came through the chinking between logs as if the gaps were open doors. It penetrated clapboard siding that had seemed solid in summer, but proved to be nothing more than wooden lace. The heat from roaring fires went straight up chimneys and vanished into the killing cold. The fires themselves created dangerous updrafts that pulled more cold air in through every crack and gap. Inside the homes, frost began to form on interior walls within the first hour, thick white patterns that were beautiful and terrifying. Water in buckets froze solid despite being near fires. The air itself seemed to crystallize. Families huddled under every blanket they owned, feeding their stoves and fireplaces with desperate intensity. Children cried from cold that penetrated wool and skin and settled into bones. Parents tried to smile reassurance while their own teeth chattered. They were burning through a week's worth of cordwood in a single day. By the second day, the reality of the situation began to crystallize, like the frost on their walls. This was not a normal winter storm. This was not something that could be waited out with grim determination and extra blankets. This was survival mathematics, and the equation was brutal. Heat lost versus heat generated. Time remaining versus fuel remaining. They were losing. In the home of Mayor Thaddeus Brennan, the man who had stood before the town council and promised that cordwood would be sufficient. The crisis was personal and immediate. His wife, Catherine, a woman of 50 who had borne him 4 children and buried one, sat wrapped in 3 quilts holding their youngest daughter. The girl was 8 years old and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that Catherine knew meant the cold was winning. "Thaddeus," she said quietly. Her breath misted in the air of their own parlor. "We will not make it." Brennan stood by the fireplace, feeding it another log from their dwindling stack. The heat was immediate and useless. It rose up the chimney and was gone. "We will endure," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. "For how long we have perhaps 3 more days of wood. The storm shows no sign of breaking. And then what? We burn the furniture. We burn the house itself." Brennan stared into the fire. He was 58 years old. He had built a life on certainty, on the belief that experience and tradition were sufficient guides, on the conviction that what had worked before would work again. He thought of the girl, the widow, standing in front of the town council with her calculations and her warnings. It will not be enough. She had been right. He turned to look at his wife, at his daughter with her blue lips, at his 2 sons huddled together under blankets by the useless fire. His pride had brought them here. His refusal to listen. His dismissal of knowledge he did not understand, simply because it came from someone he considered beneath his notice. "I was wrong," he said quietly. Catherine looked at him with eyes that held no judgment, only exhaustion. "Yes," she said, "you were." Across town in the home he had built with lumber from his own mill, Gideon Mitchell sat alone in his study. His family was in the main room, gathered around the largest fireplace in Ashford Ridge. The fire was consuming logs at a rate that Mitchell's businessman's mind calculated automatically. 2 cords of wood burned in 36 hours. He had supplied the entire town with 2 cords per family. His own family had 5 by virtue of his wealth and position. 5 cords would last perhaps 9 days at this rate. The storm was not going to stop in 9 days. Mitchell had spent 40 years turning trees into profit. He understood lumber the way sailors understood the sea. He knew the density of different woods, their burn rates, their structural properties. What he had failed to understand was thermodynamics. Wood was fuel, excellent fuel. It burned hot and clean and provided immediate heat, but heat that went up a chimney was heat lost. Heat in a poorly insulated structure was heat wasted. All his lumber, all his wealth, all his knowledge of timber was meaningless when the structures themselves could not retain what was generated. The houses were the problem. The girl had told them this. She had stood in front of them and explained thermal efficiency. She had used words like thermal mass and geothermal stability. He had called it old wives' tales. Now he sat in his expensive home burning his expensive wood and watched his family shiver despite the roaring fire, and understood that his fortune was built on a foundation he had never questioned until it failed. He thought of the cabin that burned in 1843, Amos Whitlock's father, a family saved by a root cellar, by the earth. He thought of the young widow on the hillside building something no one believed would work, and he wondered if she was still alive. In the church, Reverend Josiah Walsh knelt on floorboards so cold they burned his knees even through his trousers. He had been praying for 6 hours. He prayed for deliverance, for the wind to cease, for the cold to break, for God to show mercy. The only answer was the demonic shriek of wind through the bell tower. Walsh was 52 years old. He had preached faith for 30 years. He had told his congregation that providence would provide. That prayer and righteousness were armor against the trials of the world. He had called the girl's proposal uncivilized, pagan, against God's plan. Now kneeling in a church so cold that ice formed on the altar cloth, he confronted a crisis deeper than frozen fingers and dwindling firewood. If prayer alone could not stop this storm, what did that mean about faith? If survival required practical preparation that he had dismissed as ungodly, what did that mean about wisdom? He thought of the girl's quiet voice. My grandmother helped deliver half the children in this room. He thought of his own 4 children, all born alive and healthy because of Elizabeth Whitmore's knowledge. Knowledge he had praised when it served him and condemned when it challenged him. The cold, he realized, was not just physical. It was moral. It was the temperature of a truth he did not want to face. God helped those who prepared wisely. and he had prepared like a fool. On the morning of the third day, the Corbett family ran out of wood. They lived on the western edge of town, a family of 6, 4 children under the age of 12. The father, Martin Corbett, worked as a farmhand. They had never had much, and the 2 cords of wood supplied by Mitchell's mill had seemed like a fortune. It was gone. They burned their kitchen table first, then the chairs, then the bed frames, then anything that could fit into the stove. By evening, there was nothing left. The temperature in their cabin dropped below freezing despite the blankets, despite the huddle of bodies trying to share warmth that they no longer had to share. Martin tried to make the journey to a neighbor's house. He made it perhaps 50 yards before the wind knocked him down, and the cold stopped his heart. They found him 2 days later, frozen in mid-stride, one arm reaching forward as if he could grasp safety just ahead. Inside the cabin, his wife had gathered the 4 children around her. She wrapped them in every piece of cloth they owned. She sang to them lullabies, hymns, songs about summer. The cold came anyway. When neighbors found them on the 5th day after the wind had died enough to allow movement between buildings, they were still arranged as they had died. The mother in the center, arms around her children. Her body the last futile barrier against the cold. They had frozen together. The news passed from house to house like a contagion of horror. The Corbett family, gone. All of them. And they were not the only ones. Old Willem Hatcher, who lived alone and had always been too proud to ask for help, found in his bed covered with quilts that had not been enough. The Peterson twins, 19 years old, who had been caught trying to move between buildings on the 2nd day, found halfway across what had been the town square holding each other. The deaths mounted. By the 4th day, 7 were confirmed. More were suspected. The storm continued, unabated, unrelenting, indifferent. On the afternoon of the 4th day, those who remained alive gathered in the town hall. The building's massive fireplace was consuming logs at an impossible rate, and still the interior was barely above freezing. Men and women sat wrapped in blankets, their faces haggard, their eyes hollow. This was what defeat looked like. Thaddeus Brennan stood at the front of the hall. He had lost perhaps 15 pounds in 4 days. His face was drawn, his eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. "We are dying," he said simply. No one argued. "Our wood will not last. The storm will not break. And we," his voice caught, "we were warned." Silence. Then a young voice spoke from the back. Levi Hartwell, a farmhand of 22, who had watched the strange girl digging on the hillside with more curiosity than contempt. "Miss Caldwell," he said, "the cave girl." Several people turned to look at him. "She built that place, that hole in the ground. If the storm hit her as hard as it hit us, she is dead," someone muttered. "Buried and frozen days ago." But Levi shook his head. What if she is not? What if she was right? Her place is underground, out of the wind. She said, the earth holds warmth when air cannot. What if... He trailed off, but the thought hung in the frozen air. What if... Amos Whitlock. The old carpenter stood with difficulty. His joints had stiffened in the cold, but his mind remained sharp. I saw what she built, he said. Before the storm, sound construction. Deep enough to be below the frost line, oriented to catch sun. If anyone could survive in that hole... He paused. It would not be a miracle. It would be engineering. Gideon Mitchell stood. His face was gray. You think she might be alive? I think we owe her the attempt, Whitlock said. Reverend Walsh rose slowly. A rescue mission in this storm is suicide. Staying here is slower suicide, Brennan said quietly. He looked around the room at faces that were already grieving people who were not yet dead. At children who might not see spring. At the evidence of his own catastrophic failure of leadership. He met Whitlock's eyes. We have to try. 6 men volunteered. Brennan, Mitchell, Walsh. Whitlock, despite his age and his joints. Levi Hartwell, the young farmhand. And Jacob Thorne, a blacksmith, whose strength might be needed. They prepared as if for war. Multiple layers of clothing. Scarves wrapped around faces until only eyes showed. Rope tied around their waists connecting them so they could not be separated in the whiteout. Brennan's wife, Catherine, gripped his arm before he left. If she is alive, she whispered. Beg her forgiveness, beg her help. Pride is not worth dying for. I know, Brennan said. I know. They stepped out into the storm. The world outside was no longer recognizable as the Dakota territory they knew. It was an alien landscape of white violence. The wind hit them like a physical wall, driving them backward. The cold was beyond comprehension, beyond endurance. They bent forward and began to walk. The distance from the town hall to the edge of Prudence Caldwell's property was perhaps 600 yards. Under normal conditions, a 5-minute walk. It took them nearly 2 hours. They crawled more than walked. They fought for every foot. The rope connecting them became a lifeline as visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The snow was chest-deep in places, thigh-deep everywhere else. Gideon Mitchell fell twice. His legs simply gave out muscles frozen and unresponsive. The others hauled him back to his feet by brute force, dragging him forward because stopping meant death. Thaddeus Brennan felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm that he knew could not be sustained. His breath came in ragged gasps that burned his lungs. Each inhalation was like swallowing ice. He was a civic leader, a man of speeches and proclamations, a man accustomed to comfort and respect. Out here he was just meat, freezing meat that was running out of time. But he kept moving. The slope appeared more as a sensation than a sight. The ground tilted upward beneath their feet. They were on her land now. But where was the structure? The entire hillside was a smooth, sculpted landscape of white. The snow had drifted and built until every feature was buried. There was nothing, no sign of human habitation, no indication that anyone had ever tried to build anything here. They had come all this way to find nothing. Despair settled over them colder than the wind. Then Levi Hartwell, his young eyes sharper than the others, pointed with a hand so numb it could barely form the gesture. There, sticking out from the top of a massive snowdrift almost completely obscured, was a thin metal pipe, the exhaust vent, and from it barely visible a faint shimmer in the brutal air. Heat. Not smoke, not steam, just warmth. A subtle distortion that spoke of life below. They clawed at the snow with frozen hands. They had no shovels. They had not thought that far ahead. They used their hands, their arms, digging with the desperate energy of drowning men who had just seen the surface. The snow was like concrete, packed by wind into a density that resisted every effort. But they dug anyway. They dug until their fingers stopped working, until their arms moved on muscle memory alone, until thought itself became secondary to the single imperative dig. They uncovered the top of the glass roof. The panes were surprisingly clear beneath just a thin layer of powder. They could see down into the space below, see the glow of lamplight, see movement. Someone was alive down there. They found the front of the structure where the door should be, buried under 10 feet of snow. They dug a tunnel, a narrow burrow of their own, descending through the drift toward what they desperately hoped was salvation. Finally, their hands struck wood. The door. Brennan pounded on it with fists that had no feeling left. The sound was dull, muffled by snow and wind and desperation. No answer. He pounded again, shouting her name, though the wind snatched his voice away before it could travel more than a few feet. For a terrible moment there was only silence. Then they heard it. A faint scraping sound from within. The sound of a bar being lifted. The door opened inward, and warmth rolled over them like a benediction. They fell through the opening, a tangle of frozen limbs and desperate men. They collapsed onto the packed earth floor, unable to stand, unable to speak, able only to gasp and shake and feel the slow, terrible burning sensation of flesh that had been too cold for too long, beginning to thaw. The door closed behind them, sealing out the universe of white death. The silence was absolute, profound, life-giving. Slowly, painfully, they looked up. In the soft glow of a single lantern, Prudence Caldwell sat on a low stool by her stove. She was stirring a pot of something that smelled impossibly good. She was not haggard, not starving, not frozen. Her cheeks were rosy. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She wore a simple wool dress. No coat, no hat, no gloves. She looked up at the 6 frozen, half-dead men sprawled across her floor. Men who had called her a fool. Men who had dismissed her warnings. Men who had laughed. Her expression did not change. There was no triumph in her eyes, no bitterness, no vindication. just a calm, settled certainty, and something that might have been compassion. She spoke quietly, her voice the same clear, steady tone she had used in the town hall. "I have been expecting you. Take off your coats before you catch a chill. There is soup." Thaddeus Brennan stared up at her. Ice crystals fell from his frozen beard. His lips moved, trying to form words, but only a cracked whisper emerged. You are alive." "Yes. The storm is outside," Prudence said simply. She rose and walked to them, kneeling to help peel frozen outer garments from bodies that could not manage the task alone. "You are inside now. You are safe." Mitchell began to weep, great shuddering sobs that shook his entire frame, not from cold, from the weight of understanding what this meant. She had survived, alone, in the place they had mocked, while they had died in the structures they had trusted. Prudence did not comment on his tears. She simply worked, removing coats and scarves, checking fingers and toes. For frostbite, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. The temperature in the Earth Lodge was steady at 60 degrees. Not hot, not cold. Just enough. Just life. Levi Hartwell looked around the space with wonder. The stone walls, the glass roof above now mostly buried in snow, but still admitting a faint glow of diffused light. The ingenious stove system, with its horizontal pipe running through a thermal mass that radiated gentle warmth. "How?" he breathed. "Physics," Prudence said. "Thermal mass. Geothermal stability. The Earth holds heat that air cannot. 6 feet below the frost line, the temperature is constant. Always. The storm can rage for months. Down here we will remain warm." She ladled soup into wooden bowls and handed them out. Rabbit, vegetables, simple but hot and nourishing. The men ate in silence, feeling life return to their bodies one painful degree at a time. Finally, Brennan spoke. "The town is dying," Prudence finished quietly. "I know. How many have you lost?" "7 that we know of. The Corbett family, all 6 of them, Willem Hatcher. The Peterson twins, perhaps more. The houses cannot hold heat. The wood is running out. We cannot—" His voice broke. Prudence set down her spoon. "How many can you bring here?" The question hung in the warm air. "What?" Walsh asked. "This space can hold 14 people if they are willing to be uncomfortable. I have food and water for perhaps 10 days at that density. Less if we are not careful. But it is enough. How many do you need to save?" Brennan looked at her, this 19-year-old girl who sat in her underground sanctuary, offering to share it with the men who had scorned her. "Everyone," he whispered. "I would save everyone if I could. You cannot. The journey is too dangerous for the very old or very young. But you can save some. Choose carefully. And bring them quickly, before the next wave hits." "The next wave?" Mitchell asked, his voice hoarse. "This storm will pulse. Prudence said. She gestured to her grandmother's journal open on the stone bench. The winter of 1843 had 3 distinct intensifications, each worse than the last. We are in the first. You have perhaps 12 hours before the second arrives. The men looked at each other, understanding crystallizing. They had to go back out into the storm and bring others to safety, or leave them to die. Over the next 6 hours, working in shifts, they made 3 more trips. Each journey was a battle against wind and cold that tried to kill them. Each time they brought back more survivors. Brennan's wife, Catherine, and their youngest daughter. Mitchell's wife and 2 children. The Reverend's family. Widows. Orphans. Those who could make the journey and would not survive another day in their freezing homes. By evening, 14 people were crowded into the Earth Lodge. The space was tight. Privacy was non-existent. But the temperature held steady at 60 degrees. Outside, the second wave hit. The wind, which had seemed impossible to exceed, intensified. The temperature, which had been 38 below, dropped further. Inside, they felt it only as a change in the quality of the muffled roar, a deepening of the bass note. The snow piling against the glass and over the earth-covered roof became additional insulation. The structure, half buried, already disappeared entirely beneath a drift 20 feet deep. They were entombed, but they were warm. For the next 3 days, the Earth Lodge became an ark, a small pocket of humanity suspended between the frozen earth below and the killing storm above. Prudence managed everything with quiet, unquestioned authority. She rationed food and water with a firm hand. She showed them how the ventilation system worked, explaining why the door must remain sealed. She directed them to huddle on the stone bench to conserve body heat when the fire was reduced to coals. The men who had ruled the town now took orders from the 19-year-old widow they had mocked, and they did so without question. Their arrogance had been scoured away by the proximity of their own deaths. Their certainty had been replaced by the humility of men who had learned the hardest possible lesson. In the quiet warmth of the shelter, they talked. Brennan spoke first, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame or grief or both. I was wrong. Prudence, sitting on her stool by the stove, did not respond immediately. She simply stirred the pot, the wooden spoon turning in slow circles. Finally, she said, "Yes, you were." "My father built this town," Brennan continued. "His methods, his timber, his way of surviving winters. I thought that tradition was wisdom, that what had worked before would work again. I confused longevity with correctness." He looked at her. "You tried to warn us, you gave us evidence. You offered a solution. And I dismissed you, not because you were wrong, but because you were young and female, and said things I did not want to hear. And now 17 people are dead," Mitchell said quietly. The mill owner sat with his head in his hands. The Corbett children, Willem, the Petersons, all of them froze in houses I built, in structures I swore were sufficient. My lumber, my pride, my... He could not finish. Prudence ladled soup into a bowl and handed it to him. "Drink," she said simply. Reverend Walsh, sitting in a corner with his family, spoke for the first time in hours. "I called your knowledge pagan. I said it was uncivilized, against God's plan." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I preached that faith alone would protect us. That prayer was armor. And when the storm came, when my congregation froze and died, I knelt in that church and prayed for deliverance and heard nothing, just wind." He looked at Prudence. "You knew. You prepared. You acted on knowledge instead of hope. And God used you to save us. Not my prayers, your shovels." "God helps those who prepare wisely," Prudence said. It was not a platitude. It was a statement of fact. Faith without work is empty. Prayer without action is noise. My grandmother taught me that wisdom is not owned by any one people or tradition. It is passed on through observation, through trial, through survival. She gestured around the small space. "This place exists because generations of people learned how to live with the land instead of against it. Because they observed patterns and tested solutions and preserved what worked. That knowledge saved you. Not me. I am just the vessel." Amos Whitlock, the old carpenter, nodded slowly. "Your grandmother would be proud, Miss Caldwell. You honored her teachings. You preserved what others would have let die." On the 7th day, the storm broke. The silence when it came was more shocking than the wind had been. For days, the roar had been constant, a bass note that vibrated in bones and teeth. Its absence was almost painful. Prudence was the first to notice. She sat up from her sleeping spot and tilted her head, listening. "It has stopped." They dug themselves out slowly. The tunnel they had made coming in was completely filled, but the snow had compacted enough that they could dig upward toward where they knew the surface had to be. When they finally broke through, the world they emerged into was remade. The sun was shining in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The temperature had risen to perhaps 10 degrees above zero. Warm comparatively, survivable. But the landscape was alien. Snow was piled in drifts 20 feet high, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes. The town of Ashford Ridge was buried to the eaves of its buildings. Windows were shattered, doors blown in, interiors packed with snow. The search for survivors began immediately. They found the Corbett family in their cabin, still arranged as they had died. Mother and children frozen together. Martin Corbett in the snow outside, one arm extended. They found Willem Hatcher in his bed. Quilts piled high, his face peaceful. He had simply gone to sleep and not woken. They found the Peterson twins halfway across the town square holding each other. They found more. By the end of the first day, the count was 17 dead, nearly a fifth of the town's population. Gideon Mitchell wept at each discovery. These deaths were not abstract. They had names, faces, families, and they had died at least in part because of decisions he had supported, structures he had built, certainty he had sold. Thaddeus Brennan stood in the center of what had been the town square and looked at the devastation, at buildings that would need to be rebuilt, at families that would never be whole again, at the evidence of his catastrophic failure. He turned to look at the hillside where Prudence Caldwell's Earth Lodge had saved 14 lives. "We were wrong," he said to no one in particular. "God help us, we were so wrong." Spring came eventually. It always does. On a warm afternoon in late March 1877, the survivors of Ashford Ridge gathered for a town meeting. But this meeting was different. The tone was not one of self-congratulation. It was somber, reflective, humble. Thaddeus Brennan stood at the front of the hall. He had lost weight. His face was lined in new ways. His eyes held a depth they had not possessed before the storm. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Prudence Caldwell, who sat in the front row in the same dark dress she had worn the day she tried to warn them. "I was wrong," he said simply. His voice cracked. "We were wrong, we were proud, and we were ignorant. Our pride built this town, but it also nearly destroyed it. We put our faith in our own strength, in familiar ways, in tradition, and we refused to listen to a wisdom greater than our own." He paused, struggling for composure. "That pride cost us our friends, our neighbors, 17 souls, 17 people who should be here today, who would be here if we had listened, if we had set aside our arrogance long enough to hear truth spoken by someone we thought was beneath us." He turned to face Prudence directly. "Miss Caldwell, on behalf of this town, on behalf of everyone standing here who lived, because you shared your shelter, despite every reason not to, I apologize. We mocked you. We dismissed you. We called you a fool. And you, in return, saved our lives." His voice broke completely. "We do not ask for your forgiveness. We have not earned it. We ask for your guidance. We ask you to teach us. We ask you to help us rebuild not as we were, but as we must be to survive." Prudence sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her expression was calm. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet authority it had always held. "My grandmother used to say that the earth remembers. It remembers every mistake, every lesson, every person who learned and every person who refused to learn." She paused. 17 people died. That is a heavy memory. But you can honor them, not with apologies, with action. She stood. "I will teach anyone willing to learn, not because you deserve it, but because knowledge is not owned. It is passed on, and winter will come again." That summer, the people of Ashford Ridge did not raise new log cabins. They dug. Under Prudence Caldwell's direction, men, women, and children worked together. They excavated a large communal earth shelter on the same slope where she had built her small ark, big enough to house every remaining soul in the town. They learned about thermal mass. They learned about ventilation. They learned to see the earth not as dirt to be conquered, but as a partner, a source of enduring strength and warmth. They learned to listen. Gideon Mitchell donated timber, but not for walls, for roof frames and supports, structural elements that would work with earth, not against it. Reverend Walsh led prayer, but not for divine intervention, for wisdom to learn, for humility to accept truth regardless of its source. Thaddeus Brennan organized labor, but he also labored himself. His hands blistered and calloused. His back ached. He dug alongside the people he had led so poorly and learned what it meant to build something real. Prudence moved among them, teaching, correcting, explaining. She was 19 years old, and she had become the foundation of a community that had nearly destroyed itself. They did not call her the cave girl anymore. They called her Miss Caldwell. They called her teacher. They called her the woman who had listened to the earth when no one else would. Years passed. Ashford Ridge became known across the territory as the town of Earth Lodges. Travelers would stop and marvel at buildings that seemed to grow from the hillsides, structures that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter with minimal fuel. The town thrived. Prudence never married. She was courted, certainly. Levi Hartwell, who had believed in her when others had not asked 3 times. Each time she refused gently but firmly. "I have work to do," she told him. "Knowledge to preserve. Lessons to teach. That is my family now." She was content. She lived in her earth lodge, the one she had built with her own hands in 6 weeks of solitary labor. She expanded it over the years, adding a workshop where she trained apprentices in construction techniques, adding a library for her grandmother's journals and the new observations she recorded each season. By the time she was 40, she had taught a generation. By the time she was 60, she had taught 2. The monument they erected in the center of town was simple. A stone marker with words carved by Amos Whitlock's grandson, who had learned his craft from Prudence herself. To Prudence Caldwell, who remembered what we forgot, who listened when we would not, who built with wisdom when we built with pride. The earth remembers her. On a summer afternoon in 1912, 36 years after the storm, an elderly woman sat on a bench outside her earth lodge. She was 75 years old. Her hair was white. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were still sharp. A young woman, perhaps 20, sat beside her with a journal open on her lap. The journal was new, but the pattern was old. Observations, calculations, diagrams. "Tell me again," the young woman said, "about the winter of 1876. Prudence smiled. It was a story she had told many times, but it was a story worth repeating. "The earth speaks," she began, her voice still steady after all these years. "To those who listen, not with ears, with your whole life. And when it speaks, child, you must have the courage to hear, even when no one else believes, especially then." The young woman wrote carefully, preserving words that would be passed on, as they always had been, as they always would be. In the valley below, Smoke rose from earth lodges that kept families warm in winter and cool in summer. Children played on hillsides that held their homes. Gardens grew in soil that was partner, not adversary. The town had learned, and it had survived. Prudence looked out over it all and felt her grandmother's presence like warmth from below. "The earth remembers," she said quietly. "We just have to listen